You're listening to The Pain Chaser 1, Ambuscade. This audiobook contains violence, torture, drug use, and scenes of a graphic and often disturbing sexual nature. It should go without saying that it is not intended for children. Now turn up the sound, turn down the lights, and find a comfortable place to hide. Because fear has a face, and I'm going to show it to you. This book is dedicated to Elizabeth, my mother, who has faced horrors in life much worse than those described here. Preamble. Martina Herrera stood outside the police station, one foot caught in the door to keep it from closing, the butt of her cigarette smoldering between her manicured fingers, as she watched the snow come down like an avalanche. The weather forecast had called for snow, not this ungodly blizzard. She couldn't see across to the other side of the street through the blinding plain of white. It had been 12 hours since the radio had declared a state of emergency and warned people to stay inside, and it didn't look like she would be going home anytime soon. The sun had already risen, but night blended seamlessly into day in the grip of the terrible storm. Gina Thompson, the officer scheduled to relieve her, was, much like everyone else in Kettle Creek, buried under several feet of snow. So Martina had picked up her shift. She didn't mind, really. She could use the overtime, and she was stuck there with Sheriff Whitcomb. She couldn't think of anyone that she'd rather be stuck in a building alone with for an indeterminate amount of time. He was cute, thin, well-built, with deep-set brown eyes exactly the color of coffee, and a low, gravelly voice that reminded her of a P.I. from an old black-and-white detective film. Unfortunately, he was also married, and her commanding officer. She sighed, resigning herself to the boredom, wishing she'd had the forethought to bring a book with her, and lit another cigarette off the remains of the first. Sheriff Whitcomb appeared through the crack in the door, coming around the corner with a file in his hands, and placed it down on her desk. He walked over to her and pushed the door open, wincing slightly as his eyes adjusted to the cold wind that cut like blades at his face. "I see the taxpayers' money is being well spent. Aren't you supposed to be at your desk, Herrera?" He was smiling, and she could tell he was only joking. She took a long drag on her cigarette, her shoulder brushing subconsciously against his chest as she did. "You know as well as I do, that phone isn't going to ring once. It might as well be disconnected for all the work it does around here." As if it had heard her and wished to spite her, the phone suddenly came to life, lighting up and raising a shrill cry. Not the normal ringtone, but the 911 line. In a small town like Kettle Creek, the same officer that answered the non-emergency line was often the one who also took the 911 calls. For a moment, she froze, thinking she'd imagined it, or had somehow created the sound with her words. Coming to her senses, she flicked the cigarette deep into the blinding white and barreled into the room. "Kettle Creek Police Department, what's your emergency?" she asked breathlessly. The phone crackled in her ear. The connection was obviously bad. For a moment, she thought no one was going to be able to get through, but then she heard a distant voice. Female. It sounded like it was coming from the other end of a long hallway. Need help. It's somewhere." "Ma'am," she said, "I need you to speak slowly and calmly. I can barely hear you." Static. Shit. She was going to lose the call. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" she asked. More static. It was as though the wall of snow outside was a barrier between her and the helpless voice somewhere in that ocean of noise. "Ma'am," she repeated, "can you—" She was suddenly cut off as the voice came back, stronger this time, and from somewhere in the back of her mind she imagined a hand thrusting up from below a frozen lake. "There's so much blood. We need help. blood. There was panic in the voice. What the hell was going on? She kept her nerve, stopping the fear from rising in her own voice. "Ma'am, where are you?" "We're trapped inside the old Kettle Creek High School. Something is hunting us. Killed..." The wall of static again. But at least now she knew where the woman was. "If you can hear me, I need you to listen to me very carefully. The snow is really bad outside. No one can get through the streets like this. I know you have an emergency, but it may be some time before we can get to you. But we will be sending help. Get to a safe place and stay there. Lock yourself in if you can." She listened for a response. Just static. Then, mechanical insects. Had she heard that right? Mechanical insects? Just what the hell was going on out there? "Ma'am," she said into the receiver. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" Only static answered her. "Ma'am!" Static. Then after a moment, something much worse. Silence. The line had finally failed. Sheriff Whitcomb looked at her with concern as she put the receiver down. The wall of static and snow closed in between her and those lost people, slicing the world in two. Martina had never considered herself a superstitious woman, but the feeling of foreboding that gripped her then could only be described in one way: dread. Below them, something horrible stirred, on the verge of waking, and the very earth shuddered in fear of its arrival. Chapter 1. Rebecca didn't like the look of the man when he walked into the room. He was big, unkempt, and looked either drugged or drunk, or both. He had a wild growth of bright red beard that crept out in patches on his cheeks and down his neck. The flannel shirt that he wore made her think of a lumberjack, a dangerous lumberjack. She felt comforted by the half-inch thick pane of glass that separated her from the waiting room. The giant lumbered up to her, taking a moment to stumble over the table. Yes, definitely drunk. "I'm here to see Dr. Waite," he nearly demanded, heavily lidded eyes blinking slowly. "Sign in, please." Rebecca cleared her throat, affixing her most pleasant of receptionist smiles in an effort to keep her composure. She had a feeling that things were quickly going to go south, but she didn't want to be the one to push them that direction. "Oh, I'm not a patient," he grinned maliciously. "More of an old friend." "I see," she replied cautiously. "And does Dr. Waite know you're going to be dropping by for a visit?" "No," he snorted. "But you could get on your little intercom thingy and tell him for me." "I'm sorry, Mr. Steve," he said, as though this should have been obvious. "I'm sorry, Steve, but Dr. Waite is a very busy man. Why don't you try him at home after business hours, and after you've had a chance to sober up?" "Listen, Missy," Steve the lumberjack said, "why don't you mind your own fucking business and just let Lil Larry know I'm here, okay? Before I have to start getting loud." The other two people in the waiting room, an elderly couple, were beginning to look very nervous, and the looks on their faces said Mr. Steve was already getting plenty loud. "Sir," Rebecca said, squaring her jaw and speaking as calmly as she could, "I'm going to have to ask you to leave. You can't just walk in here and start bullying people." Steve the lumberjack stood there for a long moment, swaying gently in place. She began to wonder whether he'd heard her or not, when he reached out to the small overhang to steady himself. He glanced at her name tag, and then said in a slightly lower voice, "Listen, Becky, I'm not here to cause any trouble. I just want to talk to him. Is that so much to ask?" She hated being called Becky, but she let the belittlement go in defensive tact. "Steve, seriously, you can't walk into a place of business, obviously inebriated, and expect people to just jump at the chance to do whatever you say." She decided to go the safe route, trying to appeal to his good nature. She hoped he had a good nature. "Why don't you go home and get some rest, and call Dr. Waite on the telephone? I'm sure that whatever it is you need to speak with him about can wait until after business hours." She flashed him her best smile. It felt plastic and out of place.